Today, I want to take you inside one of the most infamous prisons in the United States, Pelican Bay State Prison, located in remote Northern California. Known as one of America's first and most extreme supermax prisons, Pelican Bay represents the harshest end of the U.S. criminal justice system. Opened in 1989, Pelican Bay was designed to house the state's most dangerous and disruptive inmates, many of them gang leaders or prisoners accused of violent behavior behind bars. At the heart of the prison is the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, where inmates are held in near total isolation. Prisoners in the SHU can spend 22 to 24 hours a day alone in small concrete cells, often for years or even decades. The documentary reveals what life is like inside these cells. There are no windows to the outside world, minimal human contact, and very limited opportunities for exercise, education, or rehabilitation. Meals are passed through slots in steel doors, and communication with others is rare. For many inmates, the greatest punishment is not physical, it is psychological. Through interviews with former prisoners, guards, and experts, the film exposes the severe mental health consequences of long-term solitary confinement. Anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns are common. Some inmates describe losing their sense of identity or feeling as though time itself has stopped. Pelican Bay has also been the center of major controversy. The documentary highlights hunger strikes led by inmates protesting indefinite solitary confinement and the use of gang affiliation as a reason to keep prisoners isolated. These protests sparked national debate and legal challenges, eventually leading to reforms in California's prison system. However, the documentary also presents the perspective of prison officials who argue that Pelican Bay was created to maintain safety for staff, inmates, and the public. They claim that isolating certain prisoners was necessary to control violence and gang activity. Pelican Bay State Prison has earned a reputation as one of the most notorious and controversial prisons in the United States because it represents the extreme edge of incarceration. Located in a remote area near the Oregon border, far from major cities and public scrutiny, the prison was intentionally built to isolate not only inmates, but also the institution itself from society. From the moment it opened, Pelican Bay became a symbol of the Supermax prison model, facilities designed not for rehabilitation, but for total control and containment. What makes Pelican Bay especially infamous is its strict reliance on long-term solitary confinement, particularly within its Security Housing Unit, SHU. Unlike traditional prisons where inmates may interact, attend programs, or work, Pelican Bay's Supermax structure limits movement, communication, and human contact to an extreme degree. Prisoners are confined to small concrete cells for nearly the entire day, with their lives regulated down to the minute. This level of restriction has drawn national and international attention from human rights organizations, legal experts, psychologists, and the media. Over the years, Pelican Bay has been the center of lawsuits, protests, and public debate, largely due to accusations that its practices amount to psychological torture. Reports of inmates spending decades in isolation without clear pathways back to the general prison population have intensified criticism. The prison's notoriety is further amplified by the fact that many inmates were sent there not for new violent crimes, but for alleged gang affiliations, often based on questionable evidence. The documentary highlights how Pelican Bay has come to represent broader issues within the American prison system, including mass incarceration, racial disparities, and the balance between security and human rights. Its name alone evokes images of concrete, silence, and isolation, making it a powerful symbol of how punishment is carried out at the most severe level in the United States. Pelican Bay State Prison was officially opened in 1989 during a period when fear of violent crime and prison gang activity was at its peak in California. At the time, lawmakers and correctional officials believed that the existing prison system was unable to control inmates who were considered extremely violent, disruptive, or influential within prison gangs. As a result, Pelican Bay was designed from the ground up with a singular purpose: to isolate and contain those prisoners viewed as the greatest threat to institutional order and public safety. Unlike traditional prisons that combine punishment with rehabilitation programs, Pelican Bay was built around the philosophy of total security. Its architecture reflects this goal. Solid concrete walls, electronically controlled doors, windowless cells, and limited movement corridors were all intended to prevent escape, communication, and organized resistance. The prison was not meant to reform behavior, but to neutralize it. Officials believed that removing gang leaders and aggressive inmates from the general prison population would weaken criminal networks operating inside other facilities across the state. The inmates sent to Pelican Bay were often transferred there after being labeled as the worst of the worst. Many were accused of orchestrating violence, drug trafficking, or extortion from behind bars. Others were placed there based on intelligence suggesting gang affiliation, even if they had not committed new crimes. This classification system meant that prisoners could be confined in extreme conditions indefinitely, without a fixed release date back into the general population. The opening of Pelican Bay marked a turning point in California's correctional strategy and helped popularize the Supermax model across the United States. Other states soon followed with similar facilities, seeing Pelican Bay as a solution to overcrowding and prison violence. However, the documentary makes clear that while the prison was created in the name of safety, its existence also reflects a broader shift toward harsher, more punitive approaches to incarceration, prioritizing control and isolation over rehabilitation and human development. The Security Housing Unit, commonly known as the SHU, is the most defining and controversial feature of Pelican Bay State Prison. It was specifically designed to enforce long-term solitary confinement as a primary method of control. In the SHU, inmates are separated almost entirely from human interaction, living alone in small concrete cells that measure only a few feet across. These cells are built with solid doors, narrow slots for food, and no direct access to the outside world, creating an environment of total isolation. Prisoners housed in the SHU typically spend between 22 and 24 hours a day inside their cells. When they are allowed out, it is usually for solitary exercise in a barren, enclosed yard often referred to as a dog run, where interaction with other inmates is still prohibited. Conversations with guards are minimal and strictly procedural, and contact with family members is rare and highly restricted. This form of confinement is not temporary. Many inmates remain in the SHU for years, and some for decades. What makes the SHU especially controversial is that placement there is often indefinite. Inmates are not always given a clear timeline or concrete steps for release back into the general prison population. For many, the only way out was once through a process known as debriefing, which required prisoners to provide information about gang activity, placing them at serious personal risk. This system reinforced the prolonged use of solitary confinement as a routine practice rather than an exceptional measure. The documentary emphasizes that the SHU was not merely a disciplinary tool, but a central pillar of Pelican Bay's operating philosophy. Long-term solitary confinement was used as a means to break communication networks, suppress resistance, and exert absolute control over inmates. However, this approach has been widely criticized by psychologists, legal experts, and human rights organizations, who argue that extended isolation causes profound mental and emotional harm and raises serious ethical concerns about the limits of punishment within a modern justice system. One of the most striking realities of life inside Pelican Bay State Prison, particularly within the Security Housing Unit, is the amount of time inmates spend completely alone. Prisoners are confined to their cells for 22 to 24 hours every single day, often without meaningful breaks or variation in routine. These cells are small, sterile, and made entirely of concrete, including the bed, desk, and walls, creating an environment that feels more like a containment box than a living space. The cells typically have no windows to the outside, eliminating any sense of natural time, weather, or seasons. Artificial lighting and silence dominate the space, and the lack of visual or sensory stimulation can be overwhelming. Inmates eat all meals inside their cells, with food passed through a narrow slot in the door. Daily activities that most people take for granted, conversation, physical movement, fresh air, or sunlight, are severely limited or completely absent. When inmates are allowed to leave their cells, it is usually for a brief period of solitary exercise in an enclosed concrete yard. Even during these moments, prisoners are kept separated from others, ensuring that isolation continues beyond the cell itself. There are no group activities, shared meals, or educational programs, reinforcing a constant state of loneliness and disconnection. The documentary illustrates how this prolonged isolation affects inmates over time. Days blur together, routines become monotonous, and the absence of social interaction erodes basic communication skills. Many prisoners describe a sense of being suspended in time, where weeks, months, and years pass without significant change. This extreme confinement is not just a physical restriction, but a psychological one, shaping every aspect of an inmate's existence and reinforcing the severe nature of punishment within the Supermax system. One of the most disturbing aspects of Pelican Bay State Prison is the length of time inmates can remain in solitary confinement. Unlike short-term disciplinary segregation used in many prisons, isolation at Pelican Bay is often long-term and open-ended. Prisoners are not given a clear sentence for how long they will remain in the security housing unit, leaving many trapped in a state of uncertainty that can last for years or even decades. The documentary highlights cases of inmates who spent 10, 20, or more than 30 years in near-total isolation. For these prisoners, solitary confinement was not a temporary response to violent behavior, but a permanent condition of their incarceration. Many were placed in isolation based on alleged gang affiliation rather than specific acts of violence, meaning their continued confinement depended on administrative decisions rather than judicial rulings. This prolonged isolation creates a unique form of punishment where time itself becomes a weapon. Without social interaction, meaningful activity, or milestones to mark progress, inmates experience a sense of endlessness. Days are repetitive and indistinguishable, making it difficult to maintain hope or a sense of personal identity. Some prisoners entered isolation as young adults and emerged decades later, having spent most of their lives alone. The absence of a clear path out of solitary confinement intensifies the psychological toll. In many cases, the only way to leave the SHU was through a debriefing process that required inmates to provide information about gangs, often placing them and their families at risk. This system effectively pressured prisoners to choose between prolonged isolation or potential retaliation, reinforcing the inescapable nature of their confinement. By showing how isolation at Pelican Bay can stretch across decades, the documentary exposes the extreme endurance required to survive such conditions and raises serious questions about the long-term human consequences of a prison system that allows indefinite solitary confinement as a standard practice. A central focus of the documentary is the profound psychological damage caused by prolonged isolation at Pelican Bay State Prison. Through interviews with former inmates, mental health professionals, and prison officials, the film reveals how long-term solitary confinement affects the human mind in ways that are often irreversible. Deprived of regular social interaction, mental stimulation, and emotional connection, prisoners experience a gradual breakdown of their psychological stability. Many inmates describe developing intense anxiety, paranoia, and chronic depression after spending extended periods alone. The absence of normal human contact makes even basic communication difficult, and some prisoners report losing the ability to hold conversations or interpret social cues. Over time, isolation distorts perception, leading to hallucinations, intrusive thoughts, and a heightened sense of fear, even when no immediate threat exists. The documentary also emphasizes how the mind reacts to sensory deprivation. Without natural light, varied sounds, or meaningful activity, inmates become hyper-aware of their own thoughts, often replaying memories or imagined scenarios repeatedly. This mental loop can lead to emotional breakdowns, self-harm, and in extreme cases, suicidal behavior. Mental health experts featured in the film explain that the human brain is not designed to function in isolation, and prolonged deprivation can permanently alter emotional regulation and cognitive function. Former prisoners speak about losing their sense of identity and self-worth, describing feelings of invisibility and dehumanization. Some recount moments when they questioned their own existence or felt disconnected from reality. The documentary makes clear that while solitary confinement is often justified as a security measure, its psychological consequences are severe, widespread, and deeply damaging, turning isolation into a form of punishment that extends far beyond physical confinement. The documentary provides detailed insight into the specific mental health conditions that commonly develop among inmates subjected to long-term isolation at Pelican Bay State Prison. Depression is one of the most frequently reported effects, driven by constant loneliness, lack of purpose, and the absence of meaningful human connection. Many inmates describe overwhelming feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and emotional numbness, where motivation disappears and even the will to survive becomes difficult to maintain. Anxiety is another widespread condition, often intensified by the constant silence and unpredictability of prison life. Inmates report being in a permanent state of alertness, where minor sounds or movements trigger fear or panic. The lack of control over their environment, combined with indefinite confinement, creates chronic stress that never fully subsides. Over time, this anxiety can become debilitating, affecting sleep, concentration, and emotional stability. The documentary also highlights the prevalence of hallucinations and distorted perceptions among prisoners held in prolonged solitary confinement. Some inmates report hearing voices, seeing shadows, or experiencing vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. These symptoms are often the result of extreme sensory deprivation, where the brain begins to create stimuli in the absence of external input. Prisoners describe struggling to distinguish reality from imagination, further deepening their psychological distress. Mental health professionals featured in the film explain that these conditions are not signs of inherent mental illness, but predictable reactions to prolonged isolation. The longer inmates remain confined, the more severe the symptoms become, often compounding over time. The documentary makes clear that depression, anxiety, and hallucinations are not rare exceptions, but common outcomes of a system that relies heavily on isolation as a form of control. The documentary details how inmates at Pelican Bay State Prison turned to hunger strikes as one of the only ways to protest the conditions of their confinement. With no access to traditional forms of advocacy and limited communication with the outside world, prisoners used their own bodies as a means of resistance. These hunger strikes were organized primarily by inmates held in the security housing unit, many of whom had spent years or decades in solitary confinement with no clear path toward release. The protests were driven by demands for basic human rights, including an end to indefinite solitary confinement, improved living conditions, and a fairer system for determining gang affiliation. Prisoners also called for access to meaningful programs, adequate medical care, and opportunities to earn release from isolation through behavior-based criteria rather than forced cooperation. Despite being physically separated, inmates managed to coordinate the strikes across multiple facilities, demonstrating a rare form of collective action within an environment designed to prevent communication. The documentary shows how these hunger strikes gained national and international attention, drawing support from human rights organizations, legal advocates, and the families of incarcerated individuals. As the strikes continued, concerns grew over the declining health of participants, some of whom went weeks without food. Prison officials faced mounting pressure as the protests exposed the realities of life inside Pelican Bay to the public. These hunger strikes marked a significant moment in the history of the prison, revealing both the desperation of inmates and their determination to be heard. By highlighting these protests, the documentary underscores how extreme conditions can push prisoners toward drastic measures in their struggle for dignity and recognition within a system that offers them very few avenues for change. The documentary explains that the hunger strikes and sustained inmate protests at Pelican Bay did not end in silence, but instead became the catalyst for major legal challenges against California's prison system. As public awareness grew, civil rights attorneys, advocacy groups, and former inmates began filing lawsuits that questioned the constitutionality of long-term solitary confinement. These legal actions argued that indefinite isolation violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, particularly when prisoners were held for years without meaningful review. One of the most significant outcomes highlighted in the documentary was increased scrutiny of the state's use of gang validation as a justification for solitary confinement. Courts and lawmakers began to examine how prisoners were labeled as gang members based on minimal or unreliable evidence, such as artwork, possession of certain books, or confidential informant statements. This scrutiny exposed systemic flaws in the classification process and strengthened arguments that many inmates were being unfairly subjected to extreme conditions. As a result of mounting legal pressure and public outrage, California was forced to implement reforms within its prison system. The documentary notes changes such as limiting the length of time inmates could be held in solitary confinement and introducing step-down programs that allowed prisoners to gradually transition back into the general population. These reforms also reduced reliance on indefinite isolation and shifted focus toward behavior-based evaluations rather than gang affiliation alone. The protests at Pelican Bay thus became a turning point, demonstrating how resistance from within the prison walls could influence policy at the state level. By connecting inmate activism to legal and institutional change, the documentary shows that even in the most restrictive environments, collective action can expose injustice and force reform within deeply entrenched systems. One of the most significant themes of the documentary is the way it challenges viewers to confront difficult ethical questions surrounding the use of supermax prisons like Pelican Bay. By presenting the realities of long-term solitary confinement, the film forces us to consider whether the extreme measures taken to ensure safety and order are morally justifiable. Is it acceptable to isolate human beings for decades in small concrete cells if the intention is to protect staff, other inmates, and society at large? Or does such confinement cross the line in an inhumane treatment that violates basic human rights? The documentary highlights the tension between two competing priorities: the need to maintain security within the prison system and the responsibility to treat inmates with dignity. Prison officials argue that Pelican Bay's policies are necessary to control violence, prevent gang activity, and protect lives. From their perspective, isolation is a preventive measure rather than punishment. Yet, interviews with former prisoners and mental health experts illustrate the severe psychological, emotional, and social consequences of these policies, suggesting that the harm inflicted may outweigh any security benefits. By showing the long-term effects on both the body and mind, the film questions the moral limits of punishment in a modern justice system. It invites viewers to reflect on whether a system that allows indefinite isolation, limited human contact, and extreme sensory deprivation aligns with the values of fairness, rehabilitation, and human dignity. Additionally, it raises broader questions about societal responsibility. How much suffering is acceptable in the name of public safety, and what alternatives exist to balance security with humane treatment? Through its in-depth portrayal of life inside Pelican Bay, the documentary forces a critical examination of the ethical foundation of mass incarceration in the United States, pushing audiences to ask not only how prisons operate, but also whether the system as a whole upholds the principles of justice, humanity, and human rights. In conclusion, Inside Pelican Bay is more than just a look at a prison. It is a mirror reflecting the choices we make as a society about justice, punishment, and human dignity. It challenges us to think critically about how far is too far when it comes to incarceration, and whether safety can ever justify the human cost of prolonged isolation. By exposing the realities behind the walls of one of America's most notorious supermax prisons, The documentary reminds us that true justice requires not only accountability and security, but also compassion, fairness, and respect for the humanity of every individual, even those who have made grave mistakes.